Hi, everybody. I happened to be scrolling around mindlessly on Instagram this morning, which I sometimes do when I'm avoiding work. And I saw a post, I don't know how it got onto my feed exactly, but I saw a post about the saxophonist Kenny G. And Kenny G is not somebody that I've given a great deal of thought to in my professional career as a composer. When I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, I think my parents gave me a cassette tape called Happy Anniversary Charlie Brown, which was like a compilation of modern jazz artists and their take on the Charlie Brown theme music, which I was, I guess, into at the time. But that's the only particular memory I have of ever having consciously or intentionally listened to Kenny G's music. And, you know, something I always say to my students is you should investigate the farthest reaches of your taste. Listen to music that you're uncomfortable with, music that you think you don't like. You know, listen as broadly as you possibly can. So, for example, if a student came to me and said, you know, I'm super into Lachenmann and whatever, you know, I would certainly say to them, you know, go and listen to Scheherazade, go and listen to Tchaikovsky, listen to it critically and carefully and try to see what's going on in those pieces and what makes them work. And that's something I always do as a matter of course. And conversely, if I had a student that was super into Tchaikovsky and had never heard a note of more recent compositions, I would get them to listen to something at the opposite end of that spectrum. So I think practicing openness and listening to as wide a range of things as you possibly can is always a good idea. And I mean everything. I mean, you can listen to anything, take it seriously, pull it apart, try to see how it works. So I certainly encourage people to do that kind of thing, be aware of what they're hearing constantly. And so when I saw this Kenny G post, it kind of got my curiosity up. I thought, well, here's somebody who I've heard a lot about, certainly, most of it negative, unfortunately, but never actually sat down and listened to consciously and critically. So what I did was, as I usually do, I live right on the border between France and Germany, and I like to go and have a coffee in Germany, you know, sort of take a break during the middle of the day on my bike. So I go over there. It takes me about 10 minutes to get across the border, and I go and have a coffee, and then I come back home. So that gives me some time also to listen to things on my headphones. So today I was listening to Kenny G's album, New Standards. So I listened to it twice, actually. That's probably the first time that I've really properly sat down and listened to Kenny G. And as I was sort of preparing for this, I read a couple of quotes about Kenny G that also got my curiosity up because, you know, he's weirdly enough kind of a polarizing figure. So here's two quotes that I'm going to read to you. So Branford Marsalis says, "When all these jazz guys get in a tizzy over Kenny G, they need to leave Kenny alone. He's not stealing jazz. The audience he has wouldn't be caught dead at a real jazz concert or club. It's not like some guy says, you know, I used to listen to Miles, Train, and Ornette, and then I heard Kenny G, and I never put on another Miles record. It's a completely different audience." So he has his defenders, for sure. Then on the other end of that critical spectrum, you have Pat Metheny, who says, "Kenny G was not really an advanced player. He had major rhythmic problems and his harmonic and melodic vocabulary was extremely limited, mostly to pentatonic-based and blues lick-derived patterns, and he basically exhibited only a rudimentary understanding of how to function as a professional soloist in an ensemble. The other main thing I noticed was that he also, as he does to this day, plays horribly out of tune, consistently sharp. Kenny G has created a new low point in modern culture, something that we should all be totally embarrassed about and afraid of. We ignore this, let it slide, at our own peril." So yeah, this got me curious. So I thought, okay, I'm going to listen to his new album. This was released last year. It's called New Standards. Yeah, so I listened to it twice. I'm going to be completely honest. It made my bike ride slightly more pleasant, I guess, especially in the first few minutes. But as the recording wore on, it started to get on my nerves a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some Kenny G on my headphones. You're not going to be able to hear it, hopefully, because if I put it in the video, then I'd have the copyright police knocking on my door immediately. But I'm going to listen to Kenny G and in real time just kind of give you some of my impressions about this music. Both him as a player, you know, his technique, his aesthetic, what the music does or does not do for me, and we'll take it from there. And remember, I have no a priori thoughts about Kenny G. This is my completely unvarnished reaction as somebody who, you know, really is coming at it more or less for the first time. I've probably heard it, you know, in an elevator or in a supermarket lineup at some point, but okay. Okay, so this track that I'm hearing is the first track on New Standards. It's called Emiline. okay, yeah, it's slightly sharp. That's not an issue for me in and of itself. Actually, a lot of wind players, if they're playing concertos, play very slightly sharp, partly in order to set their instrument in relief relative to the orchestra. It's very, very slight. What does bother me, though, is the tone. The tone is quite thin and pinched sounding, at least to my ears. So that's something that would be an issue for me if it continued unvaried for a long time. It's such strange music because it's completely flat in terms of its affect. I mean, there's a critique you sometimes hear of modern compositions, a kind of superficial critique, often by people who haven't actually listened all that closely, who say, well, it all sounds the same. So it's a critique that you have to be careful about dishing out, because it's just a very easy comment to make. These tracks really do all kind of sound the same to me. It's like they've got this kind of middling tempo. They're neither fast nor slow. They're not particularly exciting, but they're not particularly, I don't know, I guess they're kind of vaguely relaxing. I mean, basically the impression I have listening to this is that it's all surface with nothing inside. It's very odd. That's not intended, incidentally, automatically as a critique of Kenny G, because a lot of modern art, a lot of minimalism actually does something similar, where you're actually invited to investigate surface qualities and not think about anything else, any sort of distracting symbolism, or, like Donald Judd and his boxes. It's like, well, they're just cubic volumes made out of specific materials, metal and glass, and arranged into some kind of a sculptural shape. There's art like that makes no particular distinction between interior design and manufacturing and aesthetics, and all of those things just kind of go together. That's not exactly what I'm getting out of this Kenny G track, though. This is a little different. It's like it's music that does not admit the slightest element of danger. Okay, here's the second track. So this is Only You. Very similar to the previous one, same kind of mood, same kind of tempo. Yeah, so I was saying that this music has no element of danger to it, which is kind of strange. It's like, how do I describe this? In classical music, for example, you have this dichotomy between the same and the different, between something being familiar or consistent and something that's maybe destabilizing. And that's where the drama of a lot of pieces of music comes from. It's this fact that, well, here's how things are for now, but they could also not be this way, and here's something that could destabilize this situation. And that creates a kind of element of conflict or drama or dramaturgy, I suppose, that pushes the piece forward. There's always that little edge of danger that, that things could spin out of control. You have elements like dissonances and surprise also, things that just come out of nowhere unexpectedly. There's absolutely none of that in this music. It's like an object that doesn't cast a shadow. I mean, it sounds almost to me like music that somebody who had never heard music tried to make based on somebody else's sort of third-party description of what music is. There are things that are like that, actually, that are quite interesting. So there's a duo of artists called Komar and Manalid, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, who did this project called The Most Wanted Music and the Most Unwanted Music. I think it's called People's Choice Music, where they created these polls and asked people all these questions. And they created kind of a sample group, I guess, and asked people questions about what they most wanted to hear in a piece of music and what they least wanted to hear and so on. And then they commissioned some composers and musicians to actually produce these pieces. And I don't think I've ever laughed as hard as when I heard that, because it's just hilarious. It's like they're both equally funny. The Most Unwanted piece and the Most Wanted piece. If you've never heard that, look it up. So this is music that just occupies that weird middle ground and never, ever deviates from it. It's like there's this kind of relentless sameness about it. It's not even, I was going to say relentless cheerfulness, but it's not particularly cheerful music, actually, is it? I mean, it's really hard to get a sense that there's a human being behind it. It sounds like, it's some kind of AI or some kind of algorithm, took samples of many descriptions of what music sounds like and then tried to come up with a synthesis of all of those remarks, a certain type of music, let's say. That's what it sounds like to me. Very, very odd. I'm certainly not putting down anybody who likes Kenny G. I'm certainly not putting down the man himself. I think I've seen a couple of interviews with him. He seems like a genuinely nice person. I think he really enjoys what he does. I think he's got a really nice life, and he's been very successful, and all of that's good. He's definitely created a sound that is instantly recognizable. He always sounds like himself, and you can recognize his style in 3 seconds. On a certain level, that is an accomplishment because, that's actually not that easy to do. There's just so much music out there. It's very hard to come up with a sound that is really distinctive. So he's created a sound. I think that's probably what he's all about, actually, is this kind of particular saxophone sound he has. There's this kind of warbly vibrato on it. It's rather a bright sound. He's got these improvisatory figures and these little ornaments that he does again and again and again. You can just recognize his fingerprints instantly. I'm now on to track 3, 4 of this album. It's hard to tell. They all kind of do sound the same. There's just something about this weird, almost pathological refusal to admit any kind of ambiguity or danger or anything. It's like this world in which nothing upsetting is ever allowed to happen. And it's so ruthlessly antiseptic in that sense that it becomes, for me at least, listening to it carefully, it becomes a kind of a unsettling, slightly depressing experience. But then at the same time, I think, well, what if I listen to it as though it were a kind of an avant-garde statement? Like maybe this guy is a genuine innovator. He's making these things that are all surface. There's nothing else in them. And he's sort of drawing our attention to these surface qualities, much as certain avant-garde artists do. But no, I'm not quite convinced. Not quite convinced that's the right interpretation. As to why this music is so monstrously popular, I can only guess. It's very hard for me to connect with it. In certain circumstances, it might be desirable to have this kind of illusion that this kind of completely danger-free, sort of samey world could exist, that this kind of breezy, effortless, pseudo-elegance could exist in reality and that you could live in that space. And I could imagine, it might actually make certain environments a little bit more palatable, like if you have to be in line in a supermarket or stand in an elevator for a couple of minutes. Maybe. I don't know. I'm genuinely nonplussed. I don't get it. I don't get the appeal. So here's something that's kind of interesting about Kenny G. Like, he's a saxophone player. That in itself is kind of interesting, right? Because the saxophone is an instrument invented by a Belgian musical instrument maker in the mid-19th century. And it was invented originally actually as a kind of, as an outdoor instrument, as a military instrument. And it was available in 2 separate families, one pitched in B flat and E flat, and one pitched in F and C, depending on whether you wanted to play it with an orchestra or with a marching band out of doors. The saxophone was not a popular instrument for, most of the first half century of its existence, and really didn't catch on. But it was interesting actually that it was invented at that time when there was this huge resurgence of interest in woodwind instruments in Europe, and just an incredible. This really coincides with the Industrial Revolution. There was this incredible sort of renaissance of inventivity and creativity, and with manufacturers inventing entire new families of instruments, developing them seemingly overnight. There was all this innovating going on, and there was this tight sort of feeling of collaboration also between composers, instrument makers, and performers. It was super exciting. And the saxophone was like part of that, but didn't particularly catch on, not at first. And then it's like, flash forward, 150 years later, and here's this American guy selling 75 million albums or something like that, doing nothing but playing soprano saxophone solos. That in itself is kind of like, I'm a wind player, I'm an oboist, and that for me, like anybody who can sell 75 million albums of solo wind music, wow. I don't know what to make of that. That's amazing. But I think there's a sleight of hand here. I'm not sure that what he's doing is music. It's kind of more like the Eric Satie idea of musical furniture or musical wallpaper, where it's like a tint, that you can put on and it slightly changes the ambiance of a room. I can't help but hearing Kenny G this way. Maybe we've been listening to him all wrong. Maybe he's actually, an avant-gardist. Maybe he's thinking in these sorts of subversive terms, in terms of minimalism and Eric Satie and musical furniture. And maybe we should try an experiment, like have some Kenny G playing in a bare white wall gallery somewhere in Soho and see what happens. Just kind of as a conceptual art statement. Kind of interesting. So what track am I on? I'm on a track called Rendezvous. I don't know what to say. I can't tell when one track ends and when the other begins. It's weird. There's it's like a whole album with no contrast in it. It all sounds the same. I was reading a couple of things about Kenny G, and he's apparently, a very devoted performer. He spends 3 hours a day practicing, even at 65. And I don't actually know a lot of people at that level of their career. Not that there are that many people with that level of success as Kenny G, but I can't think of too many people who would continue to practice 3 hours a day. So that's kind of interesting. He's sort of very devoted. He talks about musical technique a lot, about how impressed he is by performers who have a lot of technique. And he also talks about how exciting it is to do things really well. That seems to be something that's important to him. There's a remark by Igor Stravinsky in one of the conversation books with Robert Kraft, Conversations with Igor Stravinsky, where Robert Kraft asks Stravinsky directly, what is musical technique? And Stravinsky's response is, the whole man. And that's such a good answer. Technique is the whole man. It's like, it's not about doing things well. It's about bringing your entire being to bear upon the artistic endeavor and how you do that. In other words, all of your faculties as a human being, your intelligence, your sensibility, your memory, your skill, your musicality, whatever it is, your emotional sharpness, your analytical faculties, everything, intellect, soul, emotions, all of it being brought to bear, focused with razor-like acuity upon the work at hand, the piece that you're writing or the piece that you're playing. That's what it is. So Kenny G seems to dispense with everything except the surface, except the sound, in fact. There's a recognizable sound, but there's nothing else. So I'm going to wrap this up. This was an interesting experience. I think I learned something by listening critically and carefully to Kenny G. I'm going to put this down now. We're still on Rendezvous. So we're only a third of the way through the album. Okay, I'll stop there for now. So I learned a few things listening to Kenny G's music today. I'm probably not going to revisit it anytime soon. Let me know in the comments what you think. If there are any Kenny G fans out there, I'd really love to hear from you. If there are any composers particularly or performers that like Kenny G, I would love to hear from you, but whatever, let me know in the comment section what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe this video. Also, we're getting so close to 50,000 subscribers. This is something we can totally do. So just don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you soon.